The image has spread from the high streets of Essex across the entire country, even perhaps the world. The image is a rather unflattering one, that of a young woman in an unfeasibly short skirt with a lurid spray tan, who's perhaps more interested in night clubbing than serious academic achievement. What did they make of the Essex Girl image in Castle Park in Colchester?
I live in Essex and I've always lived in Essex, and I actually know very little people that look like that and sound like that and go and live their lives like that, and I don't think it's right.
A lot of people think we're quite thick, everyone from Essex, and that's really not right, I don't think.
I know I'm from Essex, but I don't want to be classed as one of those Essex girls.
But a deeply entrenched stereotype, even an unfair one, will be difficult to banish. Gareth George, BBC Look East.
In 1997, the phrase Essex Girls was added to the Collins Oxford Dictionary, describing them as a characterisation of the young women of the area of Essex, thought to be materialistic and lacking in taste. In this film, we'll be exploring the real-life stories of Essex girls and whether this description of them rings any truth. Over 2,000 years ago, Boudicca, Queen of Iceni, came to this town and burnt it to the ground, liberating the Celtic tribes from the Roman Empire.
Boudicca was often called the warrior queen. We've got this image of her as somebody who drove about in a chariot with a sword, and she had long red hair. And she's become a bit of an icon for women's rights. But in fact, the actual evidence that suggests she was quite like that is not really there. I've actually been particularly interested in that evidence, and I think, in fact, that description, because there is a very specific description of her where that all comes from, how she had these strong eyes, the reddish hair, looked like a man, actually comes from a description of ancient Gauls. Because the person that wrote it, who was a Greek writing in the Roman world, he couldn't find a description of Boudicca. If you look through all the ancient manuscripts, you will not find generally descriptions of famous people in the past. They didn't do that. Well, the British Army in Boudicca was working a very clear plan. The idea was to actually destroy the points of support for the Roman army and isolate it. So they headed, first of all, the army was assembled in what is now Norfolk. They headed south to Colchester. They burnt it, destroyed it completely. As I said, ruthlessly burnt it and killed the people there. But what we found at Williams and Griffin's is we found some fragments of human bone telling us that there were people there who died on the spot. And we think what we're looking at is the remains of some of these settlers, possibly the retired soldiers who were resisting the attack. The archaeological excavations over the years have shown us that the Boudiccan destruction of the town was extremely comprehensive. We now believe that the buildings themselves were not particularly combustible. So we always find that they're completely burnt. All of them are actually burnt, which suggests to us that they were deliberately torched. So that the British went round building by building, burning them all. The remains that they left behind are really truly remarkable. It's a bit like a mini Pompeii. It's an extraordinary thing under the streets. People don't realise when they walk through the town centre that maybe 2 metres under their feet are this amazing remains, like a freeze frame of what the town was like in AD 61.
In the 16th century, a woman had very few rights and little control over her life. There had always been accusations of witchcraft, but by 1582 things had gotten much worse.
When you start looking into the history of the witch trials in Essex, a very good place to start is 1582. At that time, we had Queen Elizabeth on the throne, and England was very strongly Protestant. People lived their lives very much controlled by the church. Their belief systems were so much stronger than they are today.
The reason that there were witch hunts at that time, not just in Essex and East Anglia, but in Europe more generally, was because people believed in witchcraft. Okay, so they believed that it was possible to cause harm through magical means, There were laws against witchcraft. People could be taken to court for causing magical harm. So if you have a belief system that believes in witchcraft and a legal system that allows you to prosecute them, you will inevitably get witch trials.
If you're convicted of witchcraft where you damage property or somebody's livestock, then you could be sentenced to a year imprisonment, which would also include you appearing in the stocks or the pillory 4 times a year. If you're convicted of causing somebody's death by witchcraft, then certainly that would result in you being sentenced to death by hanging. And that's the other misconception. A lot of people say, oh, we burn witches. Well, we didn't in England, we hanged them. But before you start thinking that that was perhaps a more humane way of doing it, at that time we didn't have what's called the long drop, and you didn't have death by breaking the neck on the drop. It was a slow, horrible death by strangulation, by a short drop. So not a very nice way to go. Ursula Kemp had been involved in helping deliver babies. She had a very basic idea of what certain herbs did, and she went about helping people. Doesn't mean she was necessarily a very nice person, because she expected to be paid for what she did. And this is where things start going wrong. And in her case, she allegedly helped heal somebody who was lame, and she was refused payment, and blow me, shortly after that, the woman's lameness returned. And also previous to that, this same woman had a 3-month-old daughter which fell out of its cot, broke its neck and died. And Ursula was blamed for that, even though she wasn't anywhere near. Ursula was arrested. She was kept in a small lockup in St Osyth, which is still there today. And she was promised leniency. The local magistrate said, if you confess, you'll be treated okay. And Ursula believed that, and she named several other people in the village. And in total, 14 people were arrested and charged with witchcraft. Unlike the later trial, they were all held in Colchester Castle cells. And out of that trial, we have 2 people hanged. One was sentenced to death, but that was later reprieved to life imprisonment. And she was put in Newgate jail, and she actually survived there 4 years, which is quite something.
By the time the witch hunts had ended, countless women had been accused and interrogated, and more than 200 executed and tortured. The term witch hunt has come to mean searching for someone to blame, and suggests loss of rational control.
I think the specific things which caused the witch hunts in Essex in the 1640s were to do with the general situation of upheaval linked to the English Civil War. And then there are particular local circumstances. So, for example, there are local men, the local magistrates in charge of the courts, who are very much in favour of hunting witches. So I think we kind of need to get away from the idea a bit that it's all to do with Matthew Hopkins and John Stern as the witch finders. You have to have that general context and the specific local willingness to prosecute, otherwise you wouldn't have had any trials.
When you're talking about the 1645 trial, a couple who were arrested as part of Elizabeth Clark's confession were Anne West and her daughter Rebecca.
Rebecca West is interesting. We don't know that much about her. We don't know her age, for example. We don't really know what she looked like. We do know that when she was prosecuted, she was living in Lawford in Essex, and she was prosecuted with her mother, Anne West of Lawford. Again, that's not exceptional. Another mother-daughter pair from Mistley, Anne Leach and Helen Clark, were prosecuted as well. And that links to the idea, the belief in the 17th century, that witchcraft was passed on within families.
They didn't go to church. Now, at that time, that was awful, absolutely incredible they didn't go to church. But they weren't popular, and so they didn't put themselves up on offer. But Rebecca West was put in an awful position. She was told by Matthew Hopkins that if she gave evidence against her own mother, then she would be spared prosecution herself.
I think in 1645, when we meet Rebecca, she's already a reputed witch. Her mother's been tried for witchcraft twice already. She's already a kind of a marginalised and perhaps feared figure in her community.
She knew that her mother was in real danger because she'd been charged before with witchcraft and been acquitted. And a lot of people don't realise that if you were charged with witchcraft, you had a very good chance of getting off. It wasn't the case that everybody was convicted. About 3/4 of people charged were acquitted of the offence at court.
The local rector of her village, Lawford, a man called John Eads, questions her in the first instance, and she actually already confesses to him and claims that she's given herself to the devil. So I think when Matthew Hopkins and John Stern come along, she's already quite willing to confess to witchcraft anyway.
Rebecca knew that her mum was in real danger because, having been arrested and charged before with witchcraft, the odds were very much against her this time. And so Rebecca was put in the position to save herself. She actually gave evidence against her own mother. And her mother didn't actually know that was going to happen until the day of the court case.
We don't know much about the details of her own interrogation or her mother's, but the standard practice in Essex and East Anglia at this time was for suspects to be watched. The idea was that they would be watched to see if their familiars, their sort of demonic imps that supposedly helped them in their witchcraft, the idea that they would come and help the alleged witch. But actually, this watching wasn't as innocent as it sounds, because it amounts to sleep deprivation, because they could be watched for days and nights on end. So she may also have been searched, and again that sounds quite innocent, but it actually involved people being stripped naked and searched for the marks on their bodies where these demonic creatures, these familiars that they supposedly had, that the familiars were supposed to suckle on the witches' bodies and make these marks, and sometimes those marks would be pricked to see if they were insensitive to pain. So she may have been searched, she may have been watched. She's further questioned by Matthew Hopkins in this very building in Colchester Castle, and I think that's what's so amazing about this building, because we can make a very clear and provable connection between the witch persecutions in East Anglia and this building where she and many other women were held in 1645.
In 1872, the women's national suffragist movement began. Women began fighting for equality, and slowly things began to change.
Well, the interesting thing about the suffragettes is that they only have a 10-year period really where they're active, and that's the first decade of the last century. But actually, of course, they didn't come from nowhere. They were based on the best part of half or 3/4 of a century's worth of work done by feminists who weren't suffragettes, who didn't throw stones through windows, who didn't assault policemen, but who worked away to try and improve the condition of their fellow women. The main newspaper in Colchester was the County Standard, and the editor of that had a wife who was a feminist. I can't prove that she affected what her husband put in the paper, but I have a strong suspicion she may have done. In one of the summer periods, there was a group of men who dressed up as, the newspaper referred to them as buxom suffragettes. And one of them would jump off the pier dressed as a woman, shouting votes for women, and there'd be some of his friends in the water below, and he'd come up gasping for air, shouting votes for women, and they'd duck him again. And I mean, it was obviously something put on to amuse the tourists. So the newspapers were reporting seriously in Colchester and slightly flippantly in Clacton. So this is a letter dated late March 1912, and it's written from Myra Sad Brown's husband and Mademoiselle, who must be the children's governess, and the children. They're very touching letters, because this is a woman in her 40s who's married with children, and here she is stuck in Holloway doing time for having been a naughty girl in London. She is clearly very worried about her children, but she doesn't want to write to her husband in a negative kind of way. It starts off, "The children are quite well and very good. They speak a lot about you every night. They are wishing you good night and send you kisses." I mean, imagine that. She must have been kind of uplifted by this, but at the same time she must have shed a tear. And then the letters to her husband is all about send me medicine, send me, clean clothes, etc., etc., and worrying about the household concerns. So I think that's a very human side of the suffragette movement, and shows how these women suffered for their cause. There's no doubt about it. It did help to convince the government to give women the vote, but also what helped to convince the government to give women the vote was the solid work that the non-suffragettes, in all the work they did replacing men who'd gone to the trenches, the government couldn't neglect that. They couldn't not recognise that. And eventually, of course, they got the vote.
In 1914, World War broke out. As the men left for war, the women took their place, working across the economy as tram drivers, train drivers, postal workers and police patrols.
Women worked in all sorts of areas before 1914, so it's one of the big myths, I think, about the First World War, that it was the first time that women worked. They worked in agriculture, in the fields, they worked in textiles, they worked in other kind of factory work, they worked in domestic service, most famously in shops, all sorts of things. So this is working class women. Middle class women, by the 19th century, had been a bit more confined to the home. So they're emerging into the workplace in the early 20th century. Things like teaching and nursing and office work, that kind of thing. World War I has a major impact on women's lives, not because it introduces them to work for the first time, but because for many women it allows them to take over men's roles in a very abrupt way. They become a very visual labour force and they take on male trappings, right? The peaked caps for chauffeurs and the breeches and that sort of thing. So they look like a different kind of workforce. Also, there are new whole areas that open up for women, classically munitions. And the thing they learned there was that they were, the country needed them and would pay them and would arrange their childcare and things like that. And that was a real wake-up call for a lot of them. And after working in that kind of place, they never wanted to go back to their old jobs. So it made them feel differently about their work, I think.
Over the course of the war, the East Anglia Munition Committee had 42 members. And they produced 5 million shells, and 2 million of those shells were made here in Braintree by the female munitions workers, so it was an incredible output. They actually built a whole new fuse factory to make the fuses that went in the bombs that was entirely managed and run by women, so it was unusual and there was no men involved. And it was partly fed by scrap brass metal that Crittall had worked out a process to convert into usable brass at their forge and foundry in Braintree, which was then shipped over to the Lake and Elliot factory to be turned into fuses by the women.
They did it out of patriotism. The pay was much better than it was in, say, in service, if you were a servant or if you were working on the land. But even so, it was very, very dangerous. The materials were so dangerous and so strong that they were capable of anaesthetizing the workers while they were working. Women simply collapsed because they were breathing in these fumes. They had to wear special hats. They were not allowed to wear anything metal in their hair because it was too dangerous. Their nickname was canaries because the explosives turned their skin yellow. It affected their fingernails, which sometimes fell out. It affected their gums because their teeth fell out. And it also interfered with their menstrual cycle, which was something else that they had to suffer. The war did not result in women being treated as equals. Yes, they did get the vote in 1918, women over 30, but it wasn't until 1928 that women under 30 got the vote. But at the end of the war, most women who were doing men's jobs were brushed aside in a very, very hurried fashion because men had come back and it was considered that they should have their jobs back.
So yes, you could say that many of the advances in women's rights, they do disappear in the immediate term after the war, but in the longer term, the genie's out of the bottle. And the big change was that they gave up on domestic service. So they'd been happy working in domestic service in their millions, and then they weren't. So you'd have mothers who'd been servants, but daughters who were not happy to be domestic servants. And that's certainly the case from my family history. Great-grandmother from Essex, country girl who'd moved to London to be a servant in the before the First World War, and her daughter, my grandmother, there was no way her mother was going to let her be a servant, so she ended up working in a shop. So it was a big cultural change for women, I think.
We're here at the Colchester First World War Memorial, which brings us on to our next story. Kate Lord, a truly inspiring Essex girl who enlisted in the nursing service on the 6th of August 1914, continuing to serve in France and Belgium until 1918.
As a child in the 1950s, I remember being taken for tea with my great aunt Kate, She was well into her 80s by that time and was living just about 10 miles from the village of Birch near Colchester, which is where her large family had lived way back in the late 19th century. And I was ushered into this dark drawing room with heavy Victorian furniture, and the conversation was as dry as a biscuit, so I'm afraid I don't remember very much about her, except she was a lovely little old lady. It was only later, long after her death in 1960, that I realized she had a great many extraordinary tales to tell of her 4 years on the front line in France in the Great War, treating the injured. Luckily, unlike many other such tales, hers were not lost, because all her letters, and she wrote hundreds of them to her many sisters and to a lesser extent her many brothers. So perhaps I could just read an example of one of these hundreds of letters. It's from the officers' dressing station, Sunday 1 a.m., 2nd of May 1915. I'm writing in the ward while the orderly has his meal downstairs. Opposite me is a boy of 22 with his shoulder, left arm and left leg all in shell holes. He has curly hair, blue eyes and a serene face. And he says, "Oh, rather," to whatever you want him to do. His temperature is 103 and his pulse 136. He is often sick. His dressing this morning was half an hour of agony. When he moaned, you felt sick. I look upon it as a great privilege to be mother to these young heroes, wouldn't you? She goes on to say there are lots of others with very little wrong with them who've come here to get fit and to be passed on. And she quite often refers to the language of the soldiers, and she had a very sheltered upbringing in a vicarage, rural Essex, wouldn't have been exposed to this sort of thing before. So you mustn't be surprised if I come out with any of them when I return to Birch and sit under the umbrella tree in the garden. So she goes on this way in all these letters, alternating between very sad and moving graphic descriptions to the funny and the mundane. She finishes, "Next time you send a parcel, will you include one of those stiff, short nail brushes with 3 fronts on a handle? You know the sort?" And she even puts a little illustration of what she means. Yours, Kate. In fact, she quite often used sketches in her letters, and this one is a drawing of her tent just behind the front line. And she has her kit bag and her mat and her bed, and you can see just what life was like for a nursing sister on the Western Front.
In 1939, war is declared again, and women play a vital role both at home and in the forces. Hundreds of Essex girls take to the fields.
The fateful hour of 11 has struck, and Britain's final warning to Hitler having been ignored, a state of war once more exists between Great Britain and Germany.
It was wartime, really, that I started to remember things, and my dad was one of the first to be called up because of his age group, and my mum having to go into the munitions factory, and me and my younger brother had to cope. I mean, children did seem much more grown up in those days, I think. Things we had to put up with and go do for ourselves. The buses used to come round on the estate where I lived and pick the workers up. And then one day, while they were on the bus was machine gunned by a German plane, and it frightened the life out of my mother. And you had to more or less go where you were sent to work, but she did manage to come away from that factory, and she went to work on the railway where we had relatives working there, and it was the goods train. So it was all heavy work, nasty work really. All the women worked really hard, even on the land, you know. Behind our house we had a farm, and they were all picking peas and digging up potatoes. They were always busy doing things.
A land girl was a person who felt that she wanted to take part in the war effort by working usually in a general labouring capacity. So she would work on the fields, she would harvest the crops, she would plant the crops and do all the things that a male farm labourer would do.
Eileen, my sister, she was 3 years older than me. When the war began, she didn't want to go into the forces, so she chose the land army. On the whole, she enjoyed it because she was with a lot of other nice girls, and there was an American Air Force base quite near, and the American airmen used to come to the hostel where she was living, and they used to come in the evenings and dance and bring presents, chocolates and nylons, etc., etc. So I was a bit envious, actually. They were seconded out to different farms. The hostel held about 40 girls, and they used to have their days worked out for them on which farm they should go to and which work they could do. What she hated the most was digging up turnips and things like that when the ground was hard and frozen. She hated that.
The biggest change for women in the Second World War in terms of work is that married women and mothers come into the workplace for the first time, and there has to be a special government directive, a part-time work directive, to allow this. And part-time work is such a part of our everyday lives now. You can't believe it kind of didn't exist, but anyway, it's introduced in the Second World War to allow mothers to combine work, paid work, with looking after their children, and that's a really big change.
The war broke out in 1939, as you know, and I was very keen to join the forces, but my father wouldn't have any of it. He had to do what your dad said then. When we had Dunkirk and we lost all those men, they started conscripting women. Women were called up then. So I got called up when I was 21. And my father said to me, "You'll never be a sergeant like your father." Well, anyway, I went in the army and you had to take tests. And they said to me, "Why were you doing that job?" I said, "Because I had to earn my living." So then they said, "We'll put you on the carder." I had no idea what the carder meant, but it meant you'd be trained for an NCO. So I was trained for an NCO and came out the cars as a lance corporal, one stripe, unpaid, unwanted. But I rose through the ranks and became a sergeant major. And I had a company of 330 girls underneath me, and I knew every one of their names. And then we got demobbed. And I came out, and because I worked for players in the army, they put me up in the grade and made me one of their officers in there, which was quite a good thing. So the army did me very well. And my father was very surprised I became a sergeant major. I went to play bingo in the army, and there was an SQMS, the same as a sergeant major, sitting on the table. And this girl said, "That man keeps looking at you." "Ooh," I said. So when he came out, he said, "Can I walk you up the hill?" So I said, "Yes, you can." He said, "I'm going away tomorrow." I thought, well, all right. But when he came back, he phoned me up. And then we got married about 2 years after. So, so bingo was very lucky for me. I think that's the best prize I ever won. But it was a good life in the army. I really enjoyed it, and that changed women's lives altogether, because before we went in the army, if you got married, you had to leave your job. People didn't employ married women, and teachers had to leave, and doctors, they didn't employ those, nurses. Nobody employed married women, but of course the war changed all that. They were pleased to employ women, yes. So it did change the world a lot, yeah.
On its own, number 8.
In 1968, the female workers at the Ford factory in Dagenham went on strike for 3 weeks demanding equal pay. In 1970, the Equal Pay Act was introduced and came into force in 1975. The Act prohibited the introduction of different pay scale for the same work based upon gender.
She's a working class woman. I come from a working class background, and the jobs that she had was working in a grocer's shop, packing the boxes, and I used to sit out the back watching her do it after school. But then she had no money and 3 children, and having worked in a grocery shop in the day, she then went out and worked in a pub in the evening as a barmaid. So all my memories of my mum working in ordinary frontline blue-collar jobs, but she got the money to keep us going. And look at me, I've ended up as a British politician representing our whole country in Europe. And to be honest, I've got my mum to thank for it.
By the 1960s, a lot had changed for women since the beginning of the 20th century. Ever since 1928, they could vote, they could pursue an education if they wanted to, but there was still routine discrimination against women in the workplace, and this is what the machinists at the Dagenham Ford plant decided to strike against in 1968.
The Ford strike at Dagenham is an amazing event, I think, for women in Britain, and it needs an anniversary every time it comes around. So it's the first time that women get equal pay. There'd been a campaign for civil servants and teachers to get equal pay, and it was sort of taken up from there. And it's incredible, and they take it right to the top. I mean, they're sewing machinists on the Ford plant, and they're making the upholstery for the insides of cars. So it doesn't sound that important, but you can't send out a finished car with unfinished seats. So they bring literally the whole of Ford's European operation pretty much to a standstill because the strike is copied in other places. And so here's this this global corporation brought to its knees by the sewing machinists of Ford's, and at first they're not backed by their union, and then they are, and they take it to the top, and Barbara Castle, Secretary of State for Labour, takes on their case, and eventually the law is changed. So they have a major part to play, I think, in British history, and they're Essex girls who definitely need to be celebrated.
Throughout the history of Essex, women have often been blamed and ridiculed, but through their actions they've proved to be strong and brave, and sometimes rebellious. It's good to be from Essex.